little boy giggled with delight. A chilly breeze blew across the graveyard, scattering the fog in the lower slopes of the place. For the graveyard covered the whole top of the hill, and its paths wound up the hill and down and back upon themselves. A rattling. Someone at the main gate of the graveyard was pulling and shaking it, rattling the gates and the heavy padlock and the chain that held them. There now, said Owens. It's the babe's family, come to bring him back to the loving bosom. Leave the little man be, he added, because Mrs. Owens was putting her insubstantial arms around the toddler, soothing, stroking. Mrs. Owens said, he don't look like nobody's family, that one. The man in the dark coat had given up on rattling the main gates and was now examining the smaller side gate. It, too, was well locked. There had been some vandalism in the graveyard the previous year, and the council had taken steps. Come on, Mistress Owens, leave it be, there's a dear, said Mr. Owens when he saw a ghost, and his mouth dropped open and he found himself unable to think of anything to say. You might think, and if you did, you would be right, that Mr. Owens should not have taken on so at seeing a ghost, given that Mr. Owens and Mrs. Owens were themselves dead and had been for a few hundred years now. But given that the entirety of their social life, or very nearly, was spent with those who were also already dead. But there was a difference between the folk of the graveyard and this. A raw, flickering, startling shape, the gray color of television static, all panic and naked emotion which flooded the Owenses as if it were their own. 3 figures, 2 large, 1 smaller, but only one of them was in focus. It was more than an outline or a shimmer, and the figure said, "My baby! He is trying to harm my baby!" A clattering. The man outside was hauling a heavy garbage can across the alley to the high brick wall that ran around the part of the graveyard. "Protect my son," said the ghost, and Mrs. Owens thought it was a woman. Of course, the babe's mother. "What did he do to you?" asked Mrs. Owens, but she was already not certain that the ghost could hear that. Recently dead, poor love, she thought. It's always easier to die gently, to wake in due time in the place you were buried, to come to terms with your death, and to get acquainted with the other inhabitants. This creature had nothing but alarm and fear for her child, and her panic, which felt to the Owenses like a low-pitched screaming, was now attracting attention, for other pale figures were coming from all over the graveyard. "Who are you?" Caius Pompeius asked the figure. His headstone was now only a weathered lump of rock, but 2,000 years earlier he had asked to be laid to rest on the mound beside the marble shrine, rather than to have his body sent back to Rome, and he was one of the most senior citizens of the graveyard. He took his responsibilities extremely seriously. "Are you buried here?" "Of course she's not. Fresh dead by the look of her." Mrs. Owens put an arm around the woman's shape and spoke to her privately, in a low voice, calm and sensible. There was a thump and a crash from the high wall beside the alley. The garbage can had fallen. A man clambered up onto the top of the wall, a dark outline against the mist-smudged street lights. He paused for a moment, then climbed down the other side, holding on to the top of the wall, legs dangling, then let himself fall the last few feet, down into the graveyard. "But my dear," Mrs. Owens said to the shape, now all that was left of the 3 shapes that had appeared in the graveyard, "he's living, or not, can you imagine?" The child was looking up at them, puzzled. It reached for one of them, then the other, finding nothing but air. The woman's shape was fading fast. "Yes," said Mrs. Owens in response to something that no one else had heard. "If we can, then we will." She turned to the man beside her. "And you, Owens, will you be a father to this little lad?" "Will I what?" said Owens's brow crinkling. "We never had a child," said his wife, "and his mother wants us to protect him. Will you say yes?" The man in the black coat tripped in the tangle of ivy and half-broken headstones. Now he got to his feet and walked forward more carefully, startling an owl which rose on silent wings. He could see the baby, and there was triumph in his eyes. Owens knew what his wife was thinking when she used that tone of voice. They had not, in life and in death, been married for over 250 years for nothing. "Are you certain?" he asked. "Are you sure?" "Sure as I ever have been of anything," said Mrs. Owens. "Then yes, if you'll be its mother, I'll be its father." "Did you hear that?" Mrs. Owens asked the flickering shape in the graveyard, now little more than an outline, like distant summer lightning in the shape of a woman. It said something to her that no one else could hear, and then it was gone. She'll not come here again, said Mr. Owens. Next time she wakes, it'll be in her own graveyard, or wherever it is she's going. Mrs. Owens bent down to the baby and extended her arms. Come now, she said warmly, come to Mama. To the man Jack, walking through the graveyard towards them on a path, his knife already held in his hand, it seemed as if a swirl of mist had been curled around the child in the moonlight, and that the boy was no longer there, just damp mist and moonlight and swaying grass. He blinked and sniffed the air. Something had happened, but he had no idea what it was. He growled in the back of his throat, like a beast of prey, angry and frustrated. Hello, called the man called Jack, wondering if perhaps the child had stepped on something. His voice was dark and rough, and there was an odd edge to it, as if of surprise or puzzlement at hearing himself speak. The graveyard kept its secrets. Hello, he called again. He hoped to hear a baby cry, or utter a half word, or to hear it move. He did not expect what he actually heard. A voice, silky smooth, saying, Can I help you? The man Jack was tall. This man was taller. The man Jack wore dark clothes. This man's clothes were darker. People who noticed the man Jack when he was about his business, and he did not like to be noticed, were troubled or made uncomfortable or found themselves unaccountably scared. The man Jack looked up at the stranger, and it was the man Jack who was troubled. I was looking for someone, said the man Jack, slipping his right hand back into his coat pocket, so the knife was hidden, but there if he needed it. In a locked graveyard at night, said the stranger. It was just a baby, said the man Jack. I was just passing and I heard a baby cry, and I looked to the gates and I saw him. Well, what would anyone do? I applaud your public spiritedness, said the stranger, and yet, if you manage to find this child, how are you planning to get out of here with it? You can't climb back over the wall holding a baby. I would have called until someone let me out, said the man Jack. A heavy jingling of keys. Well, that would be me then, said the stranger. I would have had to let you out. He selected one large key from the key ring and said, Follow me. The man Jack walked behind the stranger. He took his knife from the pocket. Are you the caretaker then? Am I? Certainly in a manner of speaking, said the stranger. They were walking towards the gates, and the man Jack was certain away from the baby. But the caretaker had the keys. A knife in the dark, that is all it would take, and then he could search for the child all through the night, as if he needed to. He raised the knife. If there was a baby, said the stranger without looking back, it probably wouldn't have been here in the graveyard. Perhaps you were mistaken. It's unlikely that a child would come in here after all. Much more likely that you would have heard a night bird and saw a cat, perhaps, or a fox. They declared this place an official nature reserve, 30 years ago, around the time of the last funeral. Now think carefully and tell me you are certain it was a child that you saw. The man Jack thought. The stranger unlocked the side gate. A fox, he said. They make the most uncommon noises, not unlike a person crying. No, your visit to this graveyard was a misstep, sir. Somewhere the child you seek awaits you, but he is not here. And he let the thought sit there in the man Jack's head for a moment before he opened the gate with a flourish. Delighted to have made your acquaintance, he said, and I trust that you will find everything you need out there. The man Jack stood outside the gates to the graveyard. The stranger stood inside the gate, and he locked it again and put the key away. Where are you going? Asked the man Jack. There are other gates than this, said the stranger. My car is on the other side of the hill. Don't mind me. You don't even have to remember this conversation. No, said the man Jack agreeably. I don't. He remembered wandering up the hill, that what he had thought to be a child turned out to be a fox, that a helpful caretaker had escorted him back to the street. He slipped the knife into its inner sheath. Well, he said, good night. A good night to you, said the stranger, whom Jack had taken for a caretaker. From the shadows, the stranger watched Jack until he was out of sight. Then he moved through the night up and up to the flat place below the brow of the hill, a place dominated by an obelisk and a flat stone set into the ground, dedicated to the memory of Josiah Worthington, local brewer, politician, and later baronet, who had, almost 300 years before, bought the old cemetery and the land around it, and given it to the city in perpetuity. He had reserved for himself the best location on the hill, a natural amphitheater with a view of the whole city and beyond, and had ensured that the graveyard endured as a graveyard for which the inhabitants of the graveyard were grateful, although never quite as grateful as Josiah Worthington thought they should have been. There were, all told, some 10,000 souls in the graveyard, but most of them slept deep or took no interest in the night-to-night affairs of the place, and there were less than 300 of them up there in the amphitheater in the moonlight. The stranger reached them as silently as the fog itself, and he watched the proceedings unfold from the shadows.